Look, I'd consider myself a realist, all right? But in philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist.
Okay, what's that mean?
Means I'm bad at parties. I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
Well, that sounds god-fucking awful, Russ.
We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self. This accretion of sensory experience and feeling. Programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody. When in fact, everybody's nobody. I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming. Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight, brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
So, what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning?
I tell myself I bear witness. The real answer is that it's obviously my programming. And I lack the constitution for suicide. I get a bad taste in my mouth out here. Aluminum. Ash. Like you can smell the psychosphere.
That's Russ for ya. He starts out as the cynical Archon hunter, nihilistic and mystic at once, crushing people's programmed conceptions, challenging Empire's status quo, lifting Naga veils, and opening doors of perception. In other words, he's the perennial Gnostic revealer. Eventually, the powers and principalities break his body and torture his psyche. But in the end, he resurrects and connects with the eternal realm and ecstatically experiences Sophia herself. Literally. He's alchemically transformed and readies to fight yet again the demonic Yellow King.
The greatest trick God ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Be like Rust in True Detective Season 1. It's more important than ever, certainly to experience Sophia. How you gonna do that? By once again materializing at the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, and enter the agora of Aeon by Gnostic Radio. There, you'll encounter Gnostic truths and astral guests with viewpoints not found anywhere else on the internets. It's the only way to battle the Yellow King, or Jehovah, or whatever your head wants to call that wickedness in high places. And your version of Rust won't be a projection, actually, but a myth-making that will reveal your instincts on the reality of reality were true all along.
What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
So many astral guests at Aeon Bite. As amazing and beautiful as you are once you wake up from this nightmare called consensus reality. As Evelyn Underhill wrote, sanity consists in sharing the hallucinations of our neighbors.
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority. You would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world.
Our guest in this eternal now is very Rust-like. Truly an individual I admire and whose work has kindled so much meaning in the darkness of mere being. A friend and fellow raging Gen X and an underrated thinker this world needs more than ever. That is Chris Knowles, who arrives at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his debut novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. What an immersive read, not the cliche of a page-turner, but more like the archetype of a page-turner. And the characters in the story are both archetypal and real. And the plot is entertaining as it is haunting. For Chris brings his own inner rust and years of penetrating research from the secret sun to bear in He Will Live Up in the Sky. The novel is semi-autobiographical, not just for Chris, but every person enduring in the Black Iron Prison, as well as a classic PhilDickean work where the lines of reality and fiction are blurred during and after you read the work.
I'm afraid what you're describing is schizophrenia.
No, it's not schizophrenia. It's just a voice in my head.
Chris will talk all about this in our interview, with plenty of Gnosticism, ufology, conspiracy culture, and how writing is the ultimate form of magic. Like Rust's views, it's bleak, but we gotta go Archon hunting and crush all those programmed conceptions implanted in the collective consciousness of civilization before it's too bloody late. Where hope dies, imagination must live. And as Cesar A. Cruz wrote, art should disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed.
So be wise, because the world needs more wisdom. Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
We are all Gnostic revealers in the becoming, and writing our own gospel and living our own myth often means entering the abyss, the horror of existence that Joseph Campbell wrote about. As Chris himself wrote, the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it saddles you with a burden you can never escape. So choose very carefully where you decide to start digging and what dragons you choose to slay. Prepare to be taken places you never wanted to go. Gnosis isn't always a flower. Sometimes it's a sword. Maybe more often than not.
We're born alone, we die alone. Everything else can be fixed with Photoshop.
Maybe the human race deserves to be wiped out.
And as I answered to a listener who mentioned that meditation was igniting a lot of pain and fear in him, enlightenment was never supposed to be bliss, but horror with a newfound sense of humor. That's the secret of Buddha's smile. That's the red pill.
Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something.
There's no easy way to fight the Yellow King. I mean, I get annoyed when cats like Jordan Peterson say that we live in a time of greatest prosperity and peace. That's nice and all, my fellow ex-Klonopin addict. But guess what? Depression, alcoholism, addiction, homelessness, and suicide are all on the rise. We're not being mowed down by machine guns on the beaches of Normandy, but our souls are being crushed by the unbearable weight of consumerism and divide and conquer swamp gas. We're increasing military budgets and raising taxes while mental health care funding is being slashed and initiation institutions for both men and women are closing like the legs of a girl at an incel convention. Whoa. This is all by design, and most of the population has had their rectums shoved with blue pill suppositories to the point we can't face our collective shadow.
How about another joke, Murray?
No, I think we've had enough of your jokes.
What do you get?
I don't think so.
When you cross
I think
a
we're
mentally
done
ill
with your
loner
jokes.
with
That's
a
it.
society that abandons him and treats him like trash!
Call the police,
I'll
Gene.
tell you what you get!
Call the police.
Get what you fucking deserve!
We need to forget about the useless war on drugs and war on terrorism and start a war against the raw deal Russ spoke about, which is consensus reality. A war against sanity itself because it's ultimately a construct of hating angels and alien mind parasites. Or whatever your myth-making calls that wickedness in high places. Going back to Evelyn's quote on sanity, C.G. Jung himself once said, "Show me a sane man and I will cure him for you."
Do you know what crazy is? Crazy is majority rules. Yeah,
This is our last chance as a species before Yaldi hides the stolen divine sparks of Sophia and conceals them in another life form on another planet, or places them in robots as we march into the gulags of transhumanism.
My replicants will live as long or as short as a customer will pay. My replicants will never rebel. They will never run. They will simply obey.
Yeats! I wonder what's the latest outrage I can shoot up the veins of my rationality. Should I make Marvel or DC or Star Wars or Disney my new religion of group thought? Look, there's an article about what's coming or leaving Netflix this month. Oh my God, I wonder what politician will give me security if I just hand over my individuality. Oh, I'm so worried movie box office receipts are lower than last year. Or is there a woke version of Baby It's Cold Outside this holiday season? What a shit show.
Hey, if you do anything wrong in your life, and I find out about it, I'm going to try to take everything away from you. And I don't care when I find out. It could be today, tomorrow, 15, 20 years from now. If I find out, you're fucking finished.
Unlike normies and NPCs and the catamites of the establishment, we will experience Sophia if we continue like Rust and Chris Knowles. As Chris has also written, Gnosticism is an outsider proposition, an introvert's game. In the end, we Gnostikoi are all displaced, and recognizing it is the first step to our arc on hunting. As Chris further writes, so the problem is simple, and one begins to understand how the Gnostics saw it. Man, then, is a lifelong exile on a planet which is a prison for all mankind. He lives in a body which is a prison for the soul. He is the autochthon of a lost and invisible world.
After all this time, a switch goes off just like that.
Be like Rust. Be who you are meant to be before falling into this so-called sane world.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
Chris continues to show us, and certainly this is shown in his novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. Let's check it out. The Empire Never Ended.
You don't talk. You watch talk shows. You don't play games. You watch game shows. Travel, relationships, risk. Every meaningful existence must be packaged and delivered to you to watch at a distance so that you can remain ever sheltered, ever passive, ever ravenous consumers who can't free themselves to rise from their couches to break a sweat. Never anticipate new life. You want superheroes to protect you and make yourselves ever more powerless in the process. Well, you tell yourselves you're being looked after, that you're inches from being served and your rights are being upheld, so that the system can keep stealing from you, smiling at you all the while. Go ahead, send your supers to stop me. Grab your snacks, watch your screens, and see what happens. You are no longer in control. I am.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us, as always, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Chris Knowles, this time to discuss his novel. I want to say quote-unquote fiction, as you'll see, but it was a great read. His novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. How you doing, Chris? And glad to have you back.
Oh, I'm doing great, and it's a real pleasure being back on the Aeon Byte show.
Always glad to have you on, my friend.
I'm honored. I'm very deeply honored. Very deeply honored.
Honor is all ours, my friend. And with us, we've got the Moondog, Vance Sachi. How are you doing, Vance?
Oh, I'm hovering at about 300 feet. Going to turn on my cow abduction ray.
Well, there you go.
Momentarily.
There you go. Well, there's a lot of this discussion going on, which for He Will Live Up in the Sky, and I really enjoyed the book. As I told you, Chris, it was a page-turner. You know it's a good book when you've got about 50 pages and you're going, shit, this book's eventually going to end, and I'm not going to be happy about this. So even if I wanted to know what the ending is, I was enjoying the pace. I was enjoying everything. And I thought when you messaged me a while back and you said, hey, I got this novel coming up, I was like, wow, did Chris do like a Philip K. Dick or Stephen King and just pump it out? But no, you've been working on this for a long, long time.
Yeah, I had actually announced it back in 2015. There's actually a blog post in March of 2015. I was like, I'm working on a book. It's going to be out soon.
Soon, famous last words.
Yeah, exactly. But it just took a long time. I mean, I had the basic structure of the plot set in very early on, but I needed to find, first of all, I needed to find the characters. The characters needed to sort of reveal themselves to me. I needed to change, I did a lot of rewriting, and there's a lot of material that I left out. Because you start off your first book, you're like, I'm going to write the great American novel, and it's going to be like 1,000 pages long, and then you realize it's probably not that great of an idea. So I really pared down the focus. But through the writing of the book, the characters began to sort of make themselves known to me, and the tenor of the book changed. And I really wanted to write a book that was had a lot of information, had a lot of, for lack of a better term, spiritual content, but was also very, very entertaining. I wanted to write a book that's a thrill ride. And, like you said, a page turner, I'm very, very gratified that you say that. I wanted to write a book that was a thrill ride that, really kept people off kilter, going through the motions, and sort of put you in the, in the shoes of the main characters who are drawn into this world of, intelligence agents and remote viewing and UFOs and all this kind of stuff that they just have absolutely no concept of. They just completely oblivious to it. I didn't want to get into like the whole, that well-worn X-Files template where it's like one believes in it and one doesn't believe in it. And I didn't want to have them be believers or skeptics. I just wanted them to be just total novices and just drawn into this world and not believing what they're experiencing, because I sort of see them as representatives of the audience. I think it's important. I think one of the things that's important when you're writing these kind of stories is to always give the audience, there's a voice in there where the audience can sort of say, all right, well, I identify with that person who doesn't believe any of this, and offers this sort of very compelling, contrary explanation to what these characters are experiencing. And I came to the realization that I believe personally that's the only effective way to tell these kind of stories. But, as you can tell by the title, I mean, the title, there's a lot of Gnostic Christianity in here. There's a lot of sort of postmodern Christology. I'm sort of looking at the collapse of faith, particularly the collapse of the Catholic faith, being from New England and seeing and experiencing all that. So it took me a very long time because there's a lot of information. There's a lot of balls that I needed to juggle and tell a really fun, exciting story. So, I really, put a lot on my plate for that.
Yeah, great job. And of course, I mean, it is very much a Secret Sun novel. People who've read your blogs will see a lot of the plot lines. Of course, I saw a lot of the characters. But at the end of the day, it's got to be character driven. We have to like the characters and feel engaged. And as you said, the two main characters, Porter and Darja, I believe, they're just basically two like hired guns, two private dicks who get thrown into this horrible octopus world here in the United States. And we just go down this rabbit hole with them.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I was doing as I was working on the book, I was doing a tremendous amount of research. I was doing a tremendous amount of reading, and you really get, you start to realize that, that octopus has got its, tentacles everywhere. So many, you pick up so many rocks, and you start looking, and you find that octopus,
Yeah.
So. That's an experience that I really wanted the characters to be able to relate to, that they are delving into a world that is very real. And I wanted to, and that's another important thing, is I wanted to be as real as possible. It's very easy to sort of write a thriller or, an occult detective story or so on and so forth. And there are a bunch of conventions that you can fall back on, and there are, certain impulses that people come to expect, and I wanted to avoid all of those. I wanted to avoid all the traps that I saw a lot of these kind of books falling into.
And I think you hit it on the head about, again, it's interesting. You can put all this data, all this news about, I said, the octopus, what our government is doing, the supernatural, the deep state, all that. But maybe it doesn't stick. But when you do put it in your novel, it sticks more. And I'm thinking, why? Well, because I was seeing through the eyes of this character. I was seeing what it did to my family members. I was seeing what it did to the neighborhoods. I was seeing it firsthand. And it was much more, it was horrific. I could read a Secret Sun blog post and, okay, they did that and experimented on some kids. But when I'm through the eyes of the characters, that's when it hits home. So, I mean, that's one reason we write fiction, right?
Well, I'll tell you something. I remember hearing this report on NPR maybe about 10 years ago, and it was talking about like languages that died out, and why did certain languages die out, and why did other languages persist. And one of the reasons is because the languages that tend to survive have a corpus of literature attached to them. And I sort of saw this in the same context as cultures, is that cultures need to tell stories. Cultures need to persuade people as to their point of view through narrative, through stories. It's really not enough to bombard people with information. And of course it gets very tough because, a lot of people will want to read, a nonfiction book that explains certain historical or philosophic ideas. But I think there's a very well-earned tendency to be very leery of fiction, because there's a lot of bad fiction, and there's a lot of bad fiction that's, propaganda, that somebody is writing fiction to propagate their worldview and does so poorly. And again, like I said, I mean, one of the reasons that it took me so long to write one of the reasons, there are other reasons, but one of the reasons it took me so long to finish this book is that I would find myself drifting into those impulses, as I said, because it's easy to, it's when you're trying to solve problems, there's so many problems that you're trying to solve, in a fictional narrative, and it's just so easy to take the familiar way out, and I wanted to take the difficult way out. I wanted to, as often as I could, to ramp up the jeopardy, to ramp up the sort of intrigue, to ramp up the connections, and do so, that I want the readers to feel very off balance, as the characters do, because the characters are finding themselves in a world that they have absolutely no concept of. And they're hired to do this job, not because of their experience in this world, but because of other reasons, because, the person who hires them realizes that they have, that they have needs, that they're broken people.
Right.
They're broken people who don't have a lot of other places to go. And that's another thing that I thought was really important, because I used to listen to a lot of audiobooks while I was doing a lot of illustration and storyboards and stuff. And one thing I noticed about a lot of thrillers and detective stories and so on is that the characters are all perfect. It just drives you crazy. It's like, she was the top of her class at Harvard, and then became, an expert Green Beret, and she runs 20 miles every morning before she has her breakfast, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, who can relate to these damn characters? It's just so obvious that they just like, what they call Mary Sue, Mary Sue of all genders, where it's just like the author is projecting their I guess their inadequacies onto these fantasy characters, but I just, those stories are so impenetrable because I can't identify with the characters, and I wanted characters that are very, very broken, that are very damaged, that are very, that they had their chances and they blew them. And that to me is an interesting situation, for drama and for interaction, as far as that's concerned. But again, there are a lot of ideas here. There are a lot of stories and information, things that I've researched, a lot of things that people will be familiar from in the blog, because as I was researching these things, I was blogging about them and then I was putting them into the story. I want this to be, books that I really am inspired by is Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco.
Oh, yeah.
It's a huge inspiration. Yeah, that's a huge inspiration for this story. And, and even in some ways, the book's a satire and they're absurdist, but, the Illuminatus trilogy, certainly are inspirations here. And also, of course, Valis. Valis is just a huge inspiration for me. In so many ways, and it's interesting too, because I'm actually not as impressed by Philip K. Dick's fiction writing as I was just really captivated by his the exegesis and or exegesis, I should say, and his his spiritual writings. And I feel like you get so much of a better sense of who he was and what his stories are about. And also another book that, another Philip K. Dick book that really inspired me was Transmigration of Timothy Archer. And it inspired me in a strange way, but it definitely inspired me.
Yes, I mean, in that book, it's, again, you talk about broken people. That book, it seems everybody's broken. And in your novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky, not just the main characters, Chris, every character that you could connect to was severely broken and shattered by an unforgiving, brutal system, the government, secret agencies, secret societies. It was very painful to really connect with these characters.
Well, I don't want to scare people by saying that, because they all seem to be very good natured about their predicaments in some ways.
Yeah, they had a sense of humor. They enjoyed going out to eat and having sex and all that. But once you get under the hood, whew.
Yeah, well, I see. But this is based in part to my study of that world. When you look under the hood with a lot of these people involved in intelligence or involved in ufology or involved in psi research, there's always, it always seems that there's some sort of compulsion driving them, often trauma, often tragedy. really something that pushes them, in these fields that most people have no concept of, and most people have no real respect for. So I think that that's an important thing, that people who are involved in a lot of these pursuits have very good reasons to do so. Especially when it's not for something that they're going to get recognition for. You know what I'm saying? So I think that was just something that I really needed to explore and to explain, because that to me is part of the reality that I was trying to tell through fiction.
And another thing, you were talking about changing religions. It seemed to me that in this intelligence world, the real one, that what they're looking for are true believers. A lot of these characters, the managerial ones, were true believers, and they wanted the protagonists, Darja and Porter, to become true believers in what they were. And of course, the quote-unquote bad guys, these guys were completely drinking their own dark occult Kool-Aid. So isn't that basically it? I mean, these people they're just not collecting paychecks. They really believe in this shit.
Well, that's, when you talk about villains, to me, I've always had this theory that the worst supervillains or villains are true believers. And they do what they do not because they're not driven by malice or spite or some, psychopathy, so to speak. They're driven by their beliefs. And the ends justify the means, and it's for the greater good. All these sort of terms that can excuse horror, that you can get away with doing really terrible things because in the end result, it's for the greater good. We're serving a greater purpose. There's a columnist who I used to read, a guy named. His pseudonym is Gary Brecker. He used to call himself the War Nerd. And one of the things he talked about that I thought was just so true is that, the worst colonialist, the worst British colonialists who would carry out the most horrific massacres and the worst atrocities were the most religious. And it's like, when you hear devoutly religious, when you hear a devoutly religious proconsul is coming to your village, run for the hills. It's really true. I think that, I think it's become such a cliche to sort of bash religion, and I think there's a lot of hyperbole and drama queenism about it. When you see a lot of bashing of evangelicals or the Catholic Church, they're both guilty of plenty of bad things, but I think that there's just a tendency to really go overboard, and make them scapegoats for other people's sins. But I really believe that the people who do the worst damage do so. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. They do so out of the most what they see as the noblest instincts, the noblest motivations, that they see themselves as saviors. And if you read your Bible, the entire book is just full of horrific things being done, because it serves the greater purpose, the heaven on earth and so on and so forth. I think a lot of those stories are fictional. I think, and I know a lot of them are like stellar myths. But, nonetheless, it's something that I think has been ingrained. And, you're not going to find any shortage of examples in recent history. Look no further than the Khmer Rouge or something like that. That the salvation comes atop piles of skulls, so to speak. And again, that's another idea that I really wanted to explore, because I think when you look at people like who are involved in MK Ultra, or the successor or predecessor programs, if you look at people involved in various kinds of human experimentation, particularly on children, they always justify it, through a salvational explanation that they are doing, God's work, and you need to break a few eggs if you want to make a delicious omelet and that kind of thing, And that's really something that I really needed to convey, and I'm glad you picked up on that. So,
could you give the listener maybe a snapshot or a summary of your novel so they can, since we're talking, so they can get a framework of where this is going?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the story starts out where a rock star disappears from stage during a concert performance. At the same time, somebody is trying to shoot him, and he vanishes. And the thrust of the story is searching for him. Where did he go? Where did he disappear to? And doing so uncovers, it's like you lift up the rock and there are all sorts of creatures under there. Yeah. But the shooter is, this isn't going to be a spoiler because it's really kind of part of the opening chapter. I mean, the shooter is somebody who is undergoing really extreme mind control experimentation. Of the kind that, Jose Delgado was doing at Yale, and that kind of, beyond Manchurian Candidate experimentation. So concurrently, the Stargate program is shut down by the government, and the people involved in running the remote viewing and so on for the Department of Defense privatize. And they form, a private group that is meant to essentially press gang candidates into remote viewing. There is a very sinister undertone to this that the man running this program hires Porter and Darger, who you had mentioned before, to go out and look for people who they've been monitoring, they've been watching, all their lives in some cases, people who fit certain profiles, people who show certain potentials or abilities. So, it's a private operation, so it's not necessarily answerable to Congress and to law enforcement and so on and so forth. It can be held behind privilege, corporate privilege. So, so this retired DoD officer forms this group to basically find people who fit certain profiles and would be effective remote viewers. So, I mean, in some ways, we're entering into there is an element of science fiction in some regards here that, I don't know if there are actually programs like this. I wouldn't be surprised if there were. But, you're entering into a world where certain people are taking these abilities for granted. But as science fiction as that sounds, I mean, one of the real inspirations for this book was when I had been out at Esalen, when Jeff Kripal invited me to Esalen in 2008 and 2009, and I had listened to presentations by Russell Targ and Ed May. Russell Targ sort of started the remote viewing program at Stanford Research Institute, and Ed May, who sort of took over. He was, I think, he was CIA. I don't think he was part of it. I mean, he was a real numbers cruncher too. So, I mean, Russell Targ, I have very interesting conversations with him and Ed May. But Ed May was, he's almost like a bureaucrat. He was almost like a numbers cruncher, and he was not a woo guy. But I watched and listened to this presentation where they talked about, the percentage of successful operations that used remote viewing, the percentage of various remote viewers, accuracy, hits and misses. It was like all these sort of spreadsheets in Excel. It was very dry and bureaucratic and corporate. That really kind of got under my skin because I had always thought that remote viewing was just sort of like a hoax. I just thought it was just like a silly Art Bell coast to coast kind of thing, and here I am in this private group, this invitation private group, listening to the person who was running the program before it eventually was defunded by Congress, explain the rundown and how everything worked and the efficacy of certain viewers, and I was just like, wow, this is not like this is not a guy you would imagine buying into this. But, there was this interesting confluence of religious people, particularly within the military and in Congress, and the skeptic people who, as we know now, are all, we're all on the payroll for the CIA, the DOD, or whomever, people like, the PsyCop and those kind of organizations, Phil's Class, so on and so forth, who, were just clearly agents and on various payrolls. And they sort of ganged up in a lot more occurrences than you might imagine. But one of their big projects was to end remote viewing in the early 90s. So I sort of take that as a starting point, but what I really wanted to do was explore this overlap between, the research being done at SRI, ufology, people like Jacques Vallée, who was there both years when I had gone out there, and the whole surveillance, the burgeoning surveillance, internet, corporate, electronics, eavesdropping, all this, how all this stuff kind of really mixed together and really sort of emerged out of the same soup, which, is really fascinating. And I don't think a lot of people really understand just how deeply involved and deeply intertwined, the internet and remote viewing and ufology and the paranormal and so on and so forth. We're all sort of floating around together in the same, they're breathing the same air at the same time. And, I didn't want to sort of go back to that well because, I feel like that's been covered more effectively in other venues. So, I wanted to sort of combine it with, my own experiences and things that I knew, had greater knowledge of and take it to Massachusetts. It's the story is set in Massachusetts because, Massachusetts was very much, the counterpart of that. You had the same elements, you had the same agencies, you had the same corporations, all sort of doing very similar work. And the thing that I discovered, in the course of writing this book is that, Project Paperclip or Operation Paperclip happened, basically in my neighborhood.
In Jersey,
blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. I was just like, are you frigging kidding me? I just like, it's like, I couldn't believe when I learned that, it's like right off the coast of Wollaston, which is where, my folks lived before I was born, and then my father moved back to after my folks split up. So I spent a lot of time in that area, and it's just like a couple hundred a couple hundred feet off the beach. You had, Fort Strong, were all, Warner von Braun, and all the rest of them were headquartered. They were flown in there after the war. They were flown into the airfield in Squantum, which is at the end of Wollaston Boulevard. And I just couldn't believe that. And then finding out later that Whitey Bulger, the notorious gangster, was, he was living in Squantum. He was living 100 feet. So, right smack dab up next to Long Island and Fort Strong. And, and then it turns out he was involved with MK Ultra. And it's just like, your just head starts to spin because you just realize, oh my God, this stuff is ubiquitous. People just don't acknowledge it, and it's just everywhere. And I did a lot of research into human experimentation, and that was really rough to go through. And I got to be honest with you, a lot of that stuff I ended up leaving out of the final draft because I just didn't want to go there. It was just very disturbing. But I did want to make sure you got as much of that information as you could to just realize that this is real, and this was very real. And, the thing I say is that a lot of people don't believe that, government agencies have been experimenting on children in hospitals and so on. But, now they're doing it quite openly, aren't they? And really, they've been drug testing openly on children since, the 80s when they started in there with the Ritalin and all these kind of drugs and the Prozac and all these kind of things. So, and, now that's with the puberty blockers and the hormones and all that kind of thing. So I don't think that people should really pretend or be surprised to hear that a lot of, the stuff had been done prior, under classified jurisdiction or so on and so forth. That it's so obvious now. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. But I think that this book, in a lot of ways too, it's sort of a eulogy for Generation X. That's kind of the way I see it, because Generation X, were born, or right at the cusp of the counterculture and the Aquarian Revolution and everything like that. And in many ways, we ended up paying the price for it. Parents in the 70s just decided to abdicate their duties in very many cases, latchkey kids and so on and so forth. And I think that neglect and that lack of oversight opened up a lot of kids my age to predation, but also to sort of find themselves involved in some of these programs that I write about. So, that's something I really wanted to explore without getting too dark. I wanted to explore a lot of heavy things, like you said, and there are a lot of, frightening, horrible things that happen in the story, but I didn't want to, I don't want to bring people down too much. I want it to be entertaining, because I want to give people sort of a sense of, I don't necessarily say hope, but I want people to enjoy themselves. People don't need to be any more depressed than they already are.
Yeah, I don't know if I got hope from the novel, except what I got is sometimes, I don't know if the good guys win, but the bad guys don't always win. They make a few mistakes and they do falter. So that was and again, this is going against this giant machinery. I mean, your novel is not fiction, because there's this giant machinery, this octopus. It's right here on our shores. It's on different levels, like you said, the internet, the media, the arts, everywhere. It's pretty intense, and you can't survive. I think that's what the novel taught me. You can't survive these horrible things, and you can't do the right thing. But what do they always say?
It costs you. But it costs you.
Yeah, it always costs you.
That's the thing. Yeah. You pay a price for it. But.
Right. And you're talking about Generation X. It's like, we don't even exist. They have wiped us out from marketing, from sales, from everything. They're just taking us out, taking our heroes, taking everything. So we are definitely invisible. I've noticed, but
no, it's true.
It is true. When I go to marketing, they always tell me, well, we gotta, kowtow and get these products to millennials or boomers or Gen Zs. And I will say, well, what about Gen X? And they look at me with a blank stare at these board meetings, like, what? Who? What? They don't. So, cracks me up. But they say,
yeah. Well, we can't be blamed for anything. So, that's the only good, that's the only upside, is that, don't blame me. I'm Generation X,
We just wanted, Doc Martens and CDs. That's all we cared about. But, they say, there's a saying, Chris, that goes, sooner or later, a writer sells out everyone he or she knows. So who did you sell out, Chris, or who didn't you sell out?
I don't know how to answer that.
I do. Okay, I'm gonna say there is a character. He is steeped in the occult, a magician, brilliant. He's gay. Of course, I said, "Is that Gordon?" That was my first thing. He was Dutch. He's European. But
my lips are sealed.
Yes. I know you're not going to say anything.
Well, you can't help but be inspired by people around you. I mean, you're talking about the character Brule.
Exactly.
Brule is not. He didn't start out to be like Gordon, but he's definitely somebody who would have hung out with Gordon. I think, if they had known each other, they probably would have hit it off pretty well. But he's also, I guess, he's the closest to a believer in the story because. One of the chapters that I published on the blog was sort of the introduction where, we end up getting a lot of exposition dumped on your head and you're sort of introduced to this world. And Brule is the character that seems the most interested into it. But he's also, he's not necessarily a believer. He's a skeptic that, he's a true skeptic, I think, is the best way to put it. I mean, he's a skeptic in that he can be persuaded. He's persuadable. And, through the course of the story, when all these just crazy things start piling up on top of each other, he drinks the Kool-Aid, as Darja says, or he crosses over to the dark side, at least in part. But I think that's up to his nature, as a curious and inquisitive person. So, anybody else? Any other allegorical personas that you want to ask me about?
Actually, yes. I've got another one for you. Who is the big the writer Alice Keys? She reminded me, she's a big writer who wrote about being possessed or being abducted. So, of course, I thought of a female Whitley Strieber. So let me know if I was hot or cold or what was going on with her.
Actually, it's funny you should mention that because she's actually not Whitley Strieber. If you read the chapter when Darja and Porter are interviewing her, she's clearly incredibly delusional. I would say that she's more Kathy O'Brien than Whitley Strieber. I think that's sort of if you want to hear her voice, or even like a Carla Turner, I think is probably more the inspiration for that. But she's her own character. I'm not allegorizing anybody here, but if you wanted to know the kind of thinking that I was processing when writing her, I think a Carla Turner or a Kathy O'Brien would probably be, closer to being in that wheelhouse than Whitley. But I was definitely sort of harkening back to that era when you had a lot of those books. You had Intruders and you had Communion and, sort of a number of those books. You had a lot of people going on Oprah and Phil Donahue, so Geraldo, talking about, abductions and so on and so forth. And she's very much a product of that era.
Yeah, and what about my favorite character as we spoke when we were messaging was Don Morton, the sort of a psychopathic, killer, preppy kind of guy. And he also has I saw the Valis forces, the Jeff Buckley forces, so much of your energies passing through him when I found out about his backstory and just looked at him, and he has sort of a David Bowie vibe. So he was my favorite character.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that he's like very much like kind of a trickster character.
Right.
He had an interesting genesis because he came into the story through an earlier incarnation of the book that had a lot more flashback material, and he was just sort of a bit character. There was a children's television host who had ended up beating a young boy to death in a hotel room, and Don Morton sort of shows up, and he's sort of the network fixer who sort of takes care of everything. And but again, it's just this fascinating process where these characters tell you their own stories. They tell you who they are. They tell you what their life experiences are. And, as with all the characters, they're not stand-ins or sock puppets for anyone in particular. I mean, there are a lot of different inspirations, behind the characters. But Don Morton is a character who really fascinated me because I wanted to explore a character who is a hero. He's very heroic, but he's also very psychopathic. And he's psychopathic, one character says, he has no compunctions about killing anyone who ruins his day. And, that's something, that's a character. It was a very interesting character to write because it runs the danger of becoming a cartoon. And I wanted him to be very real. And, I wanted to, with all the characters, that you sort of, when a particular chapter focuses on them, you sort of, you're hearing them tell their own story. And Don Morton is, he's dissociative, and he's referred to as being criminally insane, but he's able to channel his psychopathic urges, mostly into doing, good and right. But when bad things happen to him, he's really driven to overkill. So yeah, he is very much a trickster character, and he is very much, he's almost like the good Joker, I guess you would say.
The good Joker.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just that kind of impulse where it's somebody who's experienced a lot of tragedy and a lot of, trauma in his life that very deeply changed him, and it's with all the other characters, very deeply broke him. But he had enough character to sort of channel it more or less in the direction of doing good. So, and maybe that was sort of a part of his coping mechanism, that, doing good is a way of maybe atoning for evil things that he's done. So just a very interesting character, and it's a character that, I want people to never be able to pin down. You can never really pin down which, one of the characters says, I never know which version of you I'm getting. And that's something that I really wanted to explore. And I will tell you now that I have sort of the basic structure of the sequel, the second chapter in the story, the second book. And, Don Morton. Don Morton will play a much larger role than he does in this book, but you will also see a lot more of his dark side. I mean, that's something that I really want to explore and get into the backstory and how he came about, because, I think it's very important, because this is a very Gnostic book. This is a book, I'm sure you picked up on the Christological symbolism that I sort of weave through it. And, even in the title, he will live up in the sky, it's like, I wanted to, really impart that this is very much, a kind of a Gnostic retelling of the gospel story in some parts. I know that sounds just ridiculously pretentious and probably might scare people, but again, all sort of baked into the thrill ride. But I really wanted to, to explore this stuff because, being from Massachusetts, being from Boston, Massachusetts, being from the town where the Archdiocese of Boston, with all its attendant sins and transgressions, is now located. Being from the town where the man who's actually been bankrolling he's passed away now, but he was the man who was bankrolling the Archdiocese of Boston and was basically running it. A lot of people don't realize this, but there was a real estate developer named why am I blanking on his name now? But there was a real estate developer from Braintree who was basically running the Catholic Church, and it had the ear of the cardinal throughout the, when Cardinal Law was running this cover up and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that was really coming out of the town that I grew up in, and I don't really go into the town that I grew up in as I have in the blog. A lot of the material that I had researched, just ended up on the blog instead of in the book. But I wanted to really explore how people, try to find meaning and try to find, substitute Christ, because we had the, rock stars in the 50s and 60s. And that's really when, church attendance began to really drop off, when a belief in Orthodox religion really began to drop off in the post-war era in the 50s and 60s. So the rock stars sort of became like these substitute gods. And now, if you go up to Massachusetts, you cross the border from Connecticut, New York, and you stop, at one of these kind of rest areas with like McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts and everything, and everybody's wearing sports gear. So it's basically like the Patriots and the Red Sox, and the Bruins have become like the substitute church. Because I grew up, post Vatican II, but I don't think that it really had sunk in yet. And I think that, being in a town that was very heavily Irish, Irish and Italian, it was like this weird mix of Irish, Italian, and like, the old English folks, it was like weird sort of, uneasy peace, I guess you would say, between these three main populations. But, so you had the English and then, the settlers and the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who had sort of lost their faith, I guess, at, maybe sometime, in the 20th century, you can't really pinpoint, but definitely after the war, that, the families started getting smaller and church attendance started dropping. And, I think that, even in the wake of Vatican II, that Catholics in cities like Boston and Chicago and maybe New York, parts of New York, sort of held in. They held strong. But I think that that period with the priests and everything in the early part of the 2000s, I think really did a number on that. And I think that the statistics bear that out. But it's interesting too, because the book is set in 1994, and that was sort of the first wave. I don't really go into that material, but that was sort of the first wave of the priest scandals that were really starting to emerge, in places like Boston and New Orleans, very heavily Catholic areas where the truth was starting to come out. And, I think that the consequences of that have been, I think they've been catastrophic. When you realize, when you have your Gnostic awakening, your reluctant Gnostic awakening, that your pastors, your shepherds, abusing the sheep, so to
say the least.
But but I really wanted to explore that, and I really wanted to explore, like how ufology becomes a substitute religion, and that the character who's sort of running the show gets into psi and remote viewing and all these kind of things after he has a near-death experience. So I wanted to sort of really delve into, without being explicit, without drawing attention to itself, but sort of present, okay, in the wake of the collapse of traditional religion, this is how people had looked for meaning. If you're writing that same story today, I mean, I think most people have, or a lot of people have just sort of collapsed into just utter nihilism. But I think in the period, the book is set in and also the book, I should also mention, is set in, in the days following the death of Kurt Cobain. So, that sort of pops up, in various characters' conversations, as setting the tone, for the story.
And a lot of people, Chris, might be saying, okay, he's got the two characters, Porter and Darja, and we know Chris, so there must be huge parallels to Scully and Mulder, the two Gnostic Christs or revealers in their own adventure. But I see them; they're actually very different.
Oh, they are very different, and I'm glad you see that. It's funny because I realized that I was kind of setting myself up for that by having those characters, but at the same time, they're not like Mulder and Scully in the fact that they're not engaged in this sort of dynamic, and they're not like super FBI agents who are at the top of their class and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're very much the opposite of that. But they also exist in an ecosystem that I don't really think Mulder and Scully exist in. I mean, the focus, in the X-Files is always on Mulder and Scully. It's always, the stories being told through their point of view. And what I really tried to do is that this is, very much an ensemble story. I mean, those are the characters who are going to be driving a lot of the story moving along, but they're not the only drivers, and they're part of a group that is a group, and I think that's much more realistic. I mean, I love the X-Files, obviously, or maybe it's better to say I'm neurotically obsessed with it, but it's the X-Files isn't real. I mean, characters in the FBI, FBI agents would never be able to get away with the things that they get away with, and they never operate the way that they operate. I really come to the conclusion, and I've written about this on the blog, that I'm not exactly sure that the X-Files is about two characters sort of investigating the paranormal. I think it's the series. And there are a lot of reasons for this, a lot of very compelling reasons for this. I think the series is about like these two specimens in a eugenics program that are being mind controlled to carry out assassins, to take out all the failures of that eugenics program. It's so funny because it's like, it's one of these fan theories, and it's just another fan theory, but the evidence is rather compelling. And one of the things being is that mind control pops up all the time in that series, and a lot of the mythology stories, quote unquote, are always paired with stories either about mind control or about magic mushrooms or LSD or something like that. It's throughout the entire series. It always pair those two stories together. One would follow the other. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, what were we really watching here? So, I mean, it's X-Files is a romantic quest. It's a classic romantic quest. It's possible, and I didn't want to write that. I wanted to write not necessarily the antithesis of that, but I wanted to avoid that because I could never do it better than they did. And, I think it's sort of been digested by the culture and its time has passed. And, there are other things that I wanted to explore,
You were talking about, your novel, the evanescing of old religions. I think it's symbolized in the prescient psychic nun who's a character in your book. But at the same time, as you've written, Chris, these religions are pretty much given to us. They're engineered from high on, from above. So what religion is, and your book, of course, is predicting what the religion is in the 21st century. Could we say it's not sports, but could the new religion be conspiracy culture? Is that where we're heading to? Is that what our Lord Mithras wants us to do? I have to put it in there, of course.
I've always said that the Gnostics were like the original conspiracy theorists, the Gnostics are really sort of the first indication. I mean, maybe you could look at the, Zoroastrians or something, but I think that the Gnostics are really sort of the first, major movement in history where they're looking at what's going on around them and saying this is like literally a conspiracy. This is literally a plot against us. This is literally, an illusion being presented to deceive us and to mislead us. So I I've always said that these are Gnostic times, and I've always said the problem is that Gnosticism is not always going to manifest the way you wish it to. If you look at the Middle East, a lot of Gnostic groups, might not be to the taste of, sort of a college-educated cosmopolitan in an American coastal city. Gnosticism doesn't always manifest itself the way an Elaine Pagels might prefer it to. And I don't want to dunk on her. I have tremendous respect for her. But even ancient Gnostic cults had a lot of unsavory rites and so on and so forth. The question then becomes: were they true Gnostic cults, or was it all sort of lumped together? Jay Kinney had sort of said that he sort of saw the Gnostic movement as being kind of like the New Age, in that it was an umbrella term that sort of, included a lot of different practices and rituals and so on and so forth. So I think that, we are in a Gnostic age, and Gnosticism is not going to proceed to everyone's taste, because it's by nature an idiosyncratic and not, an all-enveloping movement. So you are going to have, for instance, like Q people, you are going to have, this whole cringy Lucian Greaves Satanism kind of thing pop up. You are going to have, left-wing conspiracy theorists, Russiagate, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have a number of different. The sort of esoteric trans people. That they have this idea that this is all about reinventing humanity. Sort of grows out of transhumanism, which is is believed by some to have Gnostic qualities. I don't know if necessarily that's true. I think that the term Gnostic tends to get stretched beyond recognition. But, the fact that I think it's become clearer and clearer to everyone all the time that we are living in a world in which things are not what we had believed them here to sort of be, and we're finding out more and more all the time about, how involved, like intelligence agencies are in so many different fields where they don't belong, and on and on and on. So I think that, and again, one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of back this up, I could have told this story present day. I don't think like a rock star would have the same, cachet as it would in 1994. But I wanted to, and having read the book, you'll understand this, but I wanted to sort of get at what was undergirding a lot of the techno-utopianism that was being rolled out at the time through magazines like Wired and so on. This whole, the internet culture, the dot-com boom. What was the underside of that? What was maybe the hidden agenda behind that movement? Behind this whole rollout, this massive corporate enterprise. What exactly was driving this? And that's something that I explicitly touch on in the book. Because as having read the book, that one of these big tech companies does play a major role in the story. So that was very deliberate, because first of all, I don't want to have a story where everybody's just on their smartphones checking their Twitter feeds. I can't stand watching television shows now, because everybody's just pulling out their smartphone whenever the writers come to any kind of impasse that they can't solve. It just drives me crazy. And so I wanted to get behind that. The characters do have cell phones, but they don't really use them that much. They don't use them. They don't even use them like on the X-Files, where Mulder and Scully are pulling out the cell phones from the very first episode. Any time the story needs to sort of cross the river, so to speak. And I didn't want to do that. I find that very frustrating. I don't find that dramatic. I don't find it dramatic when, you know, expositions can come through your phone. It feels very, it feels like a cheat to me, you know?
No, and a lot of times they couldn't even get a signal, which was definitely very mid-90s too. So, and there was something, sometimes there were things because there were things I was wondering, are these things, and I could tell some things were fiction, not fiction, historical, but for example, there was one where you talk about this report from Iron Mountain that claims society should be in perpetual war. Is this true, Chris? Or just
that
more
is
like
true.
that
Yeah.
is true? I thought it was maybe some sort of like 1984 that we don't want to stop war just is. So this is true. That was chilling.
Well, I'll tell you something. That had come out in the 60s, and you know, as I mentioned, I mean, Lyndon B. Johnson thought it was real, and John Kenneth Galbraith thought it was real, and then in the 70s, sometime obviously some Mockingbird character just came out and said, "Oh, that's not real. I wrote that as a satire." But of course, if you actually read the report from Iron Mountain, it doesn't read anything like a satire. There's nothing satirical about it. There's no, you know, it's not like Dr. Strangelove or something. I mean, it's very dry. It's very hard to read. It's very sober. It's very meticulous, and it is very chilling. And you know, you can probably get it any number of places online. But yeah, so I did want to, you know, embed a lot of that kind of material in there. You know, that and there is, you know, plot points that are kind of based on that. And again, I want it to be as real as possible because I wanted to write a story that could happen, you know, or maybe it did happen. I don't know. You know, it's like I wanted to write a story that, you know, draws the reader in as much as it can because it feels and smells and sounds real. And, you know, there are a lot of opportunities to amp it up and sort of cartoonify a lot of things. And that might make a more, I don't know, a more easy to write story or more easy to read story. But I wanted to avoid those things because, you know, they don't serve the purpose, you know.
Well, I agree with you, Chris, and I enjoyed your novel. I look forward to the sequel. I want to see what Don Morton's up to when Darja and Porter and those guys and fighting the good fight. And I think we should take example from them. As you said, take a stand, fight the good fight, keep the faith, finish the race, as the epistle of Timothy says. But that is something we keep doing and we keep hammering away. But I think we've come to the end of the interview. First of all, Vance, thanks for keeping us company on this journey.
Oh, you're very welcome. And Chris, good luck with the book.
Thank you very much, sir.
And yeah, Chris, thank you again for coming on Aeon Agnostic Radio, as I say. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And we look forward to the next time, and good luck with your novel.
I am honored, sir. Always very deeply honored.
And there you have it, my beloved Truth Seekers. The first part of our interview with Chris Knowles on his debut novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. In our second part, we get more Secret Sun awesomeness. Chris talks mucho más about Gnosticism in general, as well as conspiracy culture in general. He intimately shares his days as a musician and relates the horrors of the music club scene, past and present. Chris gets philosophical and advises on how to survive these Gnostic times and a Philip K. Dick world. You'll also hear a lot on the spiritual battle raging around all of us, as well as Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, Philip K. Dick, and how not to compromise with the Archons and keep your true identity alive. Very useful gnosis. So please become an AB Prime member or a patron at Patreon for the complete heretical enchilada. Let's keep growing this red pill cafeteria. Damning your soul has never been this cheap, but you get your spirit back. A mere $5.99 a lunar cycle with many benefits. And some of these invite you to become part of a growing Gnostic community. And I should mention that, after almost 3 years, the price will go up at the beginning of 2020. Only $1, however. You get the same benefits at Patreon, but you can pledge per content whatever you want. Beyond full episodes, you'll get full access to our new Discord channel and the archives with more than 450 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoterica, and free thought. And full episodes of my vlog, The Abraxas Brief. You'll also get an invitation to the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where I stream the Abraxas Brief live and answer questions. And we have some truly intriguing conversations from an amazing community that includes past guests like Nicholas Laus, Robert Price, Tim Freak, Lawrence Gallian, Edward Pandemonium, and others. And I'm always there to address your issues and give you the latest on Gnostic news around the universe. Even support in the form of some shekels to PayPal or the US mail really keeps this blasphemy going. So please support this media you won't find anywhere else on the internets, even in the physical world, that meat space. Or support Chris by buying his novel and other books. We are the last stand against the world going completely dark as the demiurge smothers imagination, individuality, and consciousness in the last days of humanity. Let's go live up in the sky, as I know we can, and do so many wonders. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self.